The wind howled like a wounded wolf through the mountain pass, driving snow against the weathered logs of Helen Mae Dawson's cabin. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the pot of beans simmering over the fire. Another night alone. Another meal for one. Another evening listening to the whispers of the storm instead of human conversation. 28 winters had passed since her birth, and for the last 7 of them, this cabin had been her world. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, nestled in the valley below, had long ago decided her fate. Poor Helen Dawson, they'd mutter when they thought she couldn't hear. Something must be wrong with her. No man wants a wife who reads too many books and speaks her mind too freely. She'd stopped attending church socials after the 3rd year, stopped hoping each time a new settler arrived that perhaps this one might see past the gossip. The last straw had been when Martha Hendricks, the sheriff's sister-in-law and the town's most accomplished gossip, had loudly proclaimed at the general store that Helen was cursed by God himself to walk alone. Mark my words. Helen ladled beans into her single tin bowl and sat at the rough-hewn table her father had built before the fever took him. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, rattling the shutters she'd reinforced just last week. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls adorned with nothing but a faded daguerreotype of her parents and a calendar from 1876, 2 years out of date. But she kept it for the picture of the roses. She was halfway through her meal when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a deliberate, measured knocking at her door. Helen froze, spoon suspended halfway to her mouth. No one came up the mountain in weather like this. The nearest neighbor, old Samuel Morrison, lived 3 miles down the trail, and he'd never venture out in a blizzard. Her rifle hung on pegs above the mantel. She rose slowly, reaching for it. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Please." The word was heavily accented, barely audible above the wind. "My father, he is sick. Can we stay one night?" Helen's grip tightened on the rifle. That accent, she'd heard it before, from the Apache traders who sometimes came through town. The townspeople's warnings echoed in her mind. Never trust an Apache. They'll smile while they're planning to steal everything you own. But something in that voice, desperation mixed with dignity, made her pause. She moved to the small window beside the door and scraped away the frost with her sleeve. Through the swirling snow, she could make out 2 figures. One stood tall and broad-shouldered despite the burden of supporting the other, who slumped against him. "Just one night," the voice came again. "I give you my word." His word, as if the word of an Apache meant anything to the people of Cedar Ridge. But Helen wasn't the people of Cedar Ridge, was she? She was the woman they'd cast aside, declared unfit for decent society. Who was she to judge another outcast? She lifted the heavy bar from the door and opened it a crack, rifle still in hand. The wind immediately tried to tear the door from her grasp, sending a flurry of snow into the cabin. The man standing there was massive, at least 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His long black hair was crusted with ice, and his dark eyes met hers without flinching from the rifle barrel. But it was the figure he supported that made Helen lower her weapon. The elderly man was clearly Apache as well, his weathered face gray with exhaustion, his breathing labored. Snow had gathered in the deep lines of his face, making him look like a spirit from the old stories. "Bring him in," Helen heard herself say, stepping aside. The younger man's eyes widened slightly. Surprise, perhaps, at her quick acceptance. He maneuvered his father through the doorway with practiced care, and Helen quickly closed and barred the door against the storm. "By the fire," she directed, already moving to clear her drying herbs from the chair closest to the hearth. The old man sank into the chair with a soft groan, and his son knelt beside him, speaking rapidly in Apache. Helen caught a few words. She'd picked up fragments of the language from the traders, but not enough to understand. "Thank you," the younger man said, turning to her. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly. His face bore the sharp angles and strong features of his people, with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. His clothes were a mixture of Apache and white man's garb leather leggings, a wool coat that had seen better days, and boots that were cracked but well-maintained. "He needs to get warm," Helen said, her practical nature overcoming her nervousness. "Those wet clothes will kill him faster than any fever. Can you help him change? I have some of my father's old things." The man nodded. "I am called Noel," he said, the English name sounding strange with his accent. "My father is White Feather." "Helen Dawson," she replied automatically, then felt foolish. What did names matter at a time like this? She hurried to the trunk at the foot of her bed and pulled out her father's clothing. A flannel shirt, wool trousers, thick socks. They would be too small for Noel, but they might fit White Feather. She also grabbed the extra quilt her mother had made, the one with the wedding ring pattern that seemed to mock her single status. When she returned, Noel had removed his father's soaked outer garments and wrapped him in his own coat. The old man's eyes were closed, but his lips moved in what might have been prayer or delirium. "Is there a doctor in the town below?" Noel asked as he helped his father into the dry clothes. Helen shook her head. "Doc Morrison died last winter. There's a man who pulls teeth and sets bones. But," she didn't finish, "Tom Garrett wouldn't come up the mountain for an Apache, especially not in this weather." Noel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He finished dressing his father and wrapped the quilt around him, then stood back. Without his coat, Helen could see his own clothes were soaked through. He made no complaint, simply moved closer to the fire and held his hands out to the warmth. "You need dry clothes too," Helen said. "You'll catch your death." "I am fine." "No, you're not," she surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "My father was a tall man. His clothes might fit you well enough." For a moment, they stood facing each other across the small cabin, the fire crackling between them. Helen was acutely aware that she was alone with two strange men, one of them young and powerful enough to overpower her easily. But something in Noel's eyes, a wariness that matched her own, a pride that wouldn't allow him to take more than absolutely necessary, made her trust him. "Thank you," he said again, and this time the words carried weight. She fetched more clothes and then turned her back while he changed, busying herself with heating water for tea. Her hands shook slightly as she measured out the precious leaves. When was the last time she'd had visitors? Real visitors. Not just Samuel checking on her or the occasional peddler trying to cheat her. "Your father," Noel said suddenly. "He is gone." 5 years now," Helen replied without turning. "My mother, 2 years before that." "You live here alone since then?" "Yes." She could feel his gaze on her back, could sense his puzzlement. A white woman living alone in the mountains was almost as unusual as an Apache and his father seeking shelter from a white woman. "The people in town," she continued, not sure why she felt compelled to explain. "They think a woman alone is unnatural. They have their opinions about why no man has claimed me." "People always have opinions," Noel said quietly. "It does not make them true." Helen turned then, surprised by the understanding in his voice. He had changed into her father's clothes, the shirt stretched tight across his chest, the trousers a bit short, but dry, in the firelight, with the shadows playing across his face. He looked both dangerous and strangely vulnerable. White Feather stirred in his chair, muttering something in Apache. Noel immediately knelt beside him, touching his forehead with gentle fingers. "He burns with fever," Noel said. "Do you have medicine?" Helen moved to her herb shelf. "Willow bark for the fever, echinacea for strength. I'm not a real healer, but I've learned what I can." She prepared the tea with practiced movements, aware of Noel watching her every action. When it was ready, he helped his father drink, speaking to him in soft Apache phrases that sounded like comfort and encouragement. The old man managed a few sips before pushing the cup away. His eyes opened, focusing with difficulty on Helen. "You are kind," he said in heavily accented English. "Not all whites are kind to Apache." "Not all whites are kind to other whites either," Helen replied, thinking of Martha Hendricks and her sharp tongue. A ghost of a smile crossed Whitefeather's weathered face. "This is true. My son, he did not want to ask. Too much pride, like his mother." "Father should rest," Noel said quickly. "I rest soon enough," Whitefeather replied. "But first, I see a good woman, a strong woman, alone but not broken." Heat rose in Helen's cheeks. "You should save your strength, sir." The old man closed his eyes again, but the smile remained. Noel settled him more comfortably in the chair and then stood, seeming to fill the small cabin with his presence. "We will leave when the storm breaks," he said. "I do not wish to bring you trouble." Helen looked toward the door, where the wind still howled and snow piled against the walls. "That won't be tonight, and probably not tomorrow either. These mountain storms can last for days." "Then we must pay." "With what?" Helen interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "You have nothing but the clothes on your back, and those are soaked through. You'd insult me by offering payment for basic human decency." Noel's eyes flashed with something, anger, pride. But then his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then we must help. I am strong. I can work." "When the storm breaks," Helen agreed. "For now. Are you hungry? I have beans, cornbread, some preserved venison." "You are generous with those who have nothing to give." "I'm practical," Helen corrected. "A hungry man is a desperate man, and I prefer my guests comfortable." This time she was certain she saw amusement in his dark eyes. He helped her prepare a simple meal, moving around the small kitchen space with surprising grace for such a large man. They worked in companionable silence, the storm raging outside while inside the cabin felt warm and, for the first time in years, not empty. As they ate, Whitefeather dozed in his chair, occasionally mumbling in Apache. Noel translated some of it, memories of his wife, concerns about the weather, gratitude for the warmth. Helen found herself relaxing, the usual knot of loneliness in her chest loosening just a fraction. "Why were you traveling in this storm?" she asked eventually. Noel's face darkened. "We had no choice. The reservation agent. He decided we were troublemakers. My father spoke against the cutting of rations. They gave us one day to leave. In this weather, that's murder." "That is policy," Noel replied bitterly. "Apache lives are worth less than the flour they would save." Helen had heard stories about the reservations, but the reality of it, sitting across from a man forced to risk his elderly father's life over a complaint about food, made her stomach turn. "Where will you go?" "South, maybe Mexico. Anywhere they will let us live in peace." He looked at his father with such tenderness that Helen's heart ached. "He is old. He deserves better than running like a hunted animal." "Everyone deserves better than that," Helen said softly. They finished their meal in silence, the wind providing a mournful accompaniment. When Helen rose to clear the dishes, Noel stood as well. "I will help. You're a guest." "I am a man who keeps his hands busy or his thoughts grow dark," he said simply. So they washed dishes together, an oddly domestic scene that made Helen's chest tight with unnamed emotion. When was the last time someone had helped her with such a simple task? When was the last time she'd felt like she wasn't completely alone in the world? As if reading her thoughts, Noel said, "It is strange. Today I thought we might die in the snow. Tonight we are warm and fed. The world changes quickly." "Sometimes for the better," Helen agreed, then felt heat rise in her cheeks again. What was she saying? These men would leave as soon as the storm broke, and she would be alone again. That was her life. That was her fate. But for tonight, with the storm sealing them inside this small cabin, she could pretend otherwise. She could pretend that company was normal, that masculine voices and presence didn't make her heart race with long-suppressed hope. Whitefeather coughed, a harsh sound that broke the moment. Noel immediately went to him, feeling his forehead again. "The fever is worse." Helen joined him, noting the old man's labored breathing and flushed face. "We'll take turns watching him tonight. You need rest too." "I cannot." "You can and you will," Helen said firmly. "You're no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. I've sat up with sick folks before. I know what to do." Noel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are not what I expected from a white woman." "And you're not what the town would have me believe about Apache men," she countered. "What would they have you believe?" Helen hesitated, then decided on honesty. "That you're savages, thieves, that you'd as soon kill me as look at me." "And yet you opened your door." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Helen looked at Whitefeather, sleeping fitfully in the chair, then back at Noel. "Because I know what it's like to be judged without being known. Because I've heard enough cruel words to recognize when someone truly needs help. Because—" She paused, searching for words. "Because being alone doesn't mean being without compassion." Noel's expression softened, and, for a moment, the hardness that seemed etched into his features disappeared. "Then we were fortunate in our misfortune, to find your door in the storm." The wind chose that moment to rattle the shutters particularly hard, as if reminding them that the storm was far from over. Helen shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "I'll make up pallets by the fire," she said, needing to move, to do something with the emotions swirling inside her. "It's warmest there." Together, they arranged bedding on the floor, her extra blankets and furs creating a comfortable enough space for 2 men. Whitefeather woke enough to be moved from the chair, though he was clearly disoriented with fever. Noel spoke to him constantly in Apache, his voice gentle and reassuring. Once the old man was settled, Noel sat back on his heels. "I will take the first watch." "No," Helen said. "You're exhausted. Sleep for a few hours. I'll wake you if there's any change." She expected him to argue, but perhaps he was more tired than he let on. He stretched out beside his father, one hand resting protectively on the old man's arm. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Helen settled into her chair by the fire, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, an unexpected peace had descended. She watched the 2 men sleeping, Whitefeather's labored but steady breathing, Noel's watchful rest that spoke of years of sleeping in dangerous places. Tomorrow would bring complications. If the storm broke, they would need supplies. That meant going to town, meant facing the stares and whispers that would come with bringing Apache men into Cedar Ridge. Sheriff Pike would have opinions. Martha Hendricks would have a field day. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Helen Mae Dawson was not alone. Tonight, her cabin sheltered 3 souls against the storm. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt like perhaps her life wasn't over after all. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. But inside, warmed by flame and unexpected company, Helen kept watch through the long winter night, her heart beating with something that felt dangerously like hope. The first gray light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed by snow. Helen stirred in her chair, her neck stiff from dozing upright. The fire had burned low, but the cabin retained its warmth. She'd woken twice during the night to tend to Whitefeather, spooning willow bark tea between his parched lips while Noel slept the deep sleep of exhaustion. Now both men were awake. Whitefeather sat propped against the wall, his color better but his breathing still labored. Noel knelt beside him, speaking quietly in Apache. When he noticed Helen watching, he stood with fluid grace that belied his size. "You should have woken me," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You needed rest more than I did." Helen rose, working the kinks from her spine. How is he this morning? Better, but weak. The fever broke near dawn. That's good. Breakfast will help. She moved toward the kitchen area, then paused. I should warn you, my stores are simple. Cornmeal mush, molasses, perhaps some bacon if you eat pork. We are grateful for anything. Noel assured her, May I help? It was strange, having a man in her kitchen again. Stranger still that he moved with such consideration, careful not to crowd her in the small space. They worked in companionable silence. Noel stoking the fire while Helen mixed cornmeal and water in her heavy pot. The domestic rhythm felt both foreign and achingly familiar. You cook like someone who has practice, Noel observed, watching her efficient movements. 7 years of practice, and before that, helping my mother since I could reach the stove. She stirred the mush, adding a precious pinch of salt. A woman alone learns to do everything or do without. This is true for anyone alone, he replied, slicing bacon with her sharp knife. Man or woman. Whitefeather coughed from his palate, and both turned. The old man waved them back to their task. Do not fuss like hens, he said, his voice stronger than the night before. I have survived worse than a little cold. A little cold that nearly killed you, Noel muttered in English, clearly intending his father not to understand. I speak English better than you think, my son, Whitefeather said dryly, and my ears still work, even if my body protests. Helen hid a smile behind her hand. The relationship between father and son was touching. Noel's protective concern, Whitefeather's stubborn independence. It reminded her of her own father's final months, when she'd tried to coddle him and he'd resisted with every breath. They ate breakfast together, Whitefeather managing to sit at the table, though Noel hovered anxiously. The old man's appetite was encouraging. He finished his entire bowl of mush and even accepted a small piece of bacon. Tell me of this town below, Whitefeather said, fixing Helen with surprisingly sharp eyes. They do not welcome strangers. Helen chose her words carefully. Cedar Ridge is set in its ways. Most folks came here to escape something. The war, failed farms back east, broken dreams in California. They're protective of what they've built. Protective is one word, Noel said darkly. I have seen such protection. It usually involves guns and rope. Not everyone is like that, Helen protested, then wondered why she was defending people who had shunned her. Samuel Morrison, my neighbor down the mountain, he's a good man. And there's Mrs. Chen who runs the laundry. She knows what it's like to be an outsider. But they are few, Whitefeather said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Helen admitted. They are few. The storm had lessened during the night, though snow still fell steadily. Noel went to the door and studied the sky through a crack in the frame. Another day, perhaps 2 before travel is possible, he announced. Then you're my guests until then, Helen said firmly, and guests earn their keep around here. There's wood to split, repairs needed on the chicken coop, a dozen small tasks I've put off. Noel's face lit with something like relief. I'm good with my hands. Show me what needs doing. They spent the morning working companionably. Noel proved as capable as he'd claimed, repairing the loose boards in the chicken coop with minimal tools and maximum ingenuity. Helen found herself stealing glances at him as he worked, noting the economical grace of his movements, the way he hummed tunelessly under his breath. Whitefeather, propped in the chair by the fire, proved to be excellent company. His English, while accented, was eloquent, and he had a dry wit that caught Helen by surprise. You remind me of my wife, he said as she brought him fresh tea. She too had eyes that saw more than they should and a spine that would not bend. What happened to her? Helen asked gently. The soldiers came to our winter camp 5 years ago, said we had to move to the agency. She said she was too old to live in a cage. His eyes grew distant. She walked into the storm that night. We found her in the spring, sitting against her favorite pine tree, looking toward the mountains of her birth. Helen's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Do not be sorry. She died free. That is more than most of us can say now. He studied her with those penetrating eyes. But you understand about cages, I think, even when they have no bars. Before Helen could respond, Noel returned, shaking snow from his hair. The coop is secured. Your hens seem suspicious of the improvements. They're suspicious of everything, especially that red one. She's mean as a snake and twice as crafty. Helen welcomed the change of subject. Did you gather the eggs? Noel held up his left hand, which bore several angry pecks. The red one defended her territory well. Whitefeather chuckled. My son, who has fought bears and soldiers, defeated by a chicken. That's no ordinary chicken, Noel protested. That's a demon in feathers. The easy banter warmed the cabin more than the fire. Helen found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. When was the last time she'd shared jokes with anyone? When had her cabin heard anything but her own voice and the wind? As the day wore on, the three fell into an easy rhythm. Whitefeather dozed intermittently, but woke alert and eager for conversation. He spoke of his youth, when the Apache roamed free, of hunting buffalo on the plains, of the sacred mountains where boys became men. His stories painted pictures so vivid Helen could almost see the vast landscapes he described. Noel worked steadily on various repairs, occasionally adding his own memories. A first hunt, a horse that wouldn't be tamed. The day he earned his adult name. Helen noticed he spoke little of recent years, of the reservation or the wars. Those wounds were too fresh, she supposed. For her part, Helen found herself sharing more than she'd intended. She spoke of her parents, good people who'd tried to make a life in unforgiving land, of her mother's treasured books, saved from their journey west, of her father's determination to prove a woman could inherit and work land same as a man. He filed the claim in my name, she explained as they shared a simple lunch of biscuits and preserves. Said I'd need something of my own when he was gone. The town fathers weren't pleased, but the law was the law. A wise man. Whitefeather approved. Land is life. Without it, we are ghosts. The afternoon brought a discussion that Helen had dreaded. Whitefeather's cough had returned, worse than before, and his brief periods of energy were followed by longer exhaustion. He needs medicine I don't have, Helen said quietly to Noel as they stood by the window, watching snow fall endlessly. Proper medicine from town. Noel's jaw tightened. They will not sell medicine for Apache. They'll sell it to me. She took a breath. I'll go tomorrow if the snow lessens. No. The word came out sharp, almost harsh. Noel moderated his tone. I cannot let you take such risk for us. What risk? It's my town. I have made the trip 100 times. That was before you took in Apache guests. They will know. Small towns always know. Helen thought of Martha Hendricks's network of gossips, of Sheriff Pike's suspicious nature. Noel was right. Someone would have seen the tracks leading to her cabin, would have noticed smoke from her chimney when she should be snowed in alone. I don't care what they think, she said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. You should care. I have seen what happens to white women who show kindness to Indians. It does not end well. And I've seen what happens to Apache men who trust white promises, Helen countered. Yet, here you are in my cabin. They stood facing each other, the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Whitefeather coughed again, breaking the moment. Enough, the old man wheezed. You argue like children while I breathe like a broken bellows. Daughter. He used the term deliberately, watching Helen's reaction. If you would go to town, I would be grateful, but only if my son goes with you. Father, no. You will not let her face their anger alone, Whitefeather commanded with surprising authority. And she will not let you face their hatred without her protection. Together, you might survive both. The logic was irrefutable. though neither Helen nor Noel looked pleased. They spent the rest of the afternoon in preparation, Helen making a list of needed supplies, Noel checking and rechecking the rifle, ensuring her boots were sound for the trek. As evening fell, they shared another simple meal. The easy camaraderie of the morning had given way to tension about tomorrow's journey. Helen caught Noel staring at the fire, his face carved in hard lines. "What troubles you?" she asked softly. "I bring danger to your door. This is poor payment for kindness." "You bring humanity to my door," Helen corrected. "That's worth any danger." White Feather, who had been quiet through dinner, suddenly spoke. "There is an old story my grandmother told. A woman lived alone on a mountain, feared by all who saw her. They said she was a witch who brought storms. But one day, a warrior came to her door seeking shelter. She took him in, and he saw she was not a witch, but a woman whose loneliness had become like armor. The warrior had his own armor, pride and anger at the world's cruelty. Together, they learned to remove their armor, piece by piece." "What happened to them?" Helen asked, drawn into the tale despite herself. "What happens to all who dare to be vulnerable?" Whitefeather said with a small smile. "They found something worth the risk." Noel made a sound of frustration. "Father, your stories are not helpful." "My stories are all I have left to give," the old man replied gently. "That, and hope that my son will learn to see beyond the next battle." The evening progressed quietly after that. Helen taught Noel to play checkers using her father's carved set, amused by his intense concentration over each move. Whitefeather dozed in his chair, occasionally waking to offer commentary on their game. As the fire burned low and bedtime approached, Helen felt the strange domesticity of the scene tugging at her heart. This was what she'd dreamed of in her younger years: companionship, laughter, the simple pleasure of not being alone. But dreams had a way of mocking reality. Tomorrow would bring the harsh truth of the world beyond her door. "You fear tomorrow," Noel said quietly as they prepared Whitefeather's sleeping pallet. "No," Helen said, then amended. "Yes, but not for myself. I've faced their scorn for years. But they'll see you as a threat, and they're dangerous when they're afraid. I have faced dangerous men before. Not like this, not with your father sick and needing help. Promise me, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they say or do, don't let pride make you do something foolish." Noel was quiet for a long moment. "And will you promise the same?" Helen thought of Martha Hendricks's cutting tongue, of Sheriff Pike's cold eyes, of all the whispered judgments that had driven her to this mountain refuge. "I promise to try." "Then I will promise the same." They settled for the night, Whitefeather sleeping deeply thanks to another dose of willow bark tea. Noel took the first watch this time, insisting Helen rest for tomorrow's journey. She lay on her narrow bed, listening to the wind and the soft sounds of Noel tending the fire. Strange how quickly life could change. 2 days ago, she'd been alone, expecting nothing more than another winter of solitude. Now her cabin held 2 lives besides her own. And tomorrow she would walk into town with an Apache warrior at her side, defying every social rule that had governed her existence. Was Whitefeather right? Was loneliness just another kind of armor? And if so, what lay beneath when that armor was removed? Sleep finally took her, but not before she heard Noel singing softly in Apache a lullaby, perhaps, or a prayer. The unfamiliar words wrapped around her like a blanket, promising nothing but offering comfort nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she was not alone. The storm continued its slow death outside, but within the cabin, 3 souls found shelter in more than just walls and roof. They found it in small kindnesses, shared stories, and the fragile hope that perhaps the world could be different than what they'd always known. Helen's last thought before sleep was of her mother's favorite Bible verse: "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." She didn't know about angels, but as she drifted off to the sound of Noel's quiet singing, she thought perhaps grace came in unexpected forms, Tomorrow would test that grace. But tonight, it was enough. The morning sun reflected blindingly off the snow as Helen and Noel made their way down the mountain path. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a world wrapped in pristine white. Their breath came in visible puffs, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional crack of ice-laden branches. Helen led the way, knowing every twist and hazard of the trail even under its snowy blanket. Noel followed closely, alert as a wolf despite his easy stride. They'd left Whitefeather sleeping peacefully, the cabin warm and stocked with wood and water. Still, Helen could sense Noel's reluctance to leave his father, saw it in the way he glanced back until the cabin disappeared from view. "He'll be fine," Helen assured him. "The fever's broken, and he has everything he needs for a few hours." "It is not his body that worries me," Noel replied. "His spirit grows tired. Each time we must run, each indignity we suffer, takes more from him than any illness." They walked in silence for a while, navigating a steep section where Helen's father had carved rough steps into the hillside. Noel steadied her with a hand on her elbow when she slipped, the touch brief but warming her more than her wool mittens. As they descended, the scattered buildings of Cedar Ridge came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Helen could see people moving about despite the early hour. Her stomach tightened. In 7 years of self-imposed exile, she'd trained herself to make these town visits quick and purposeful. Get supplies, avoid conversation, retreat to her mountain. Now she was walking in with a companion who would draw every eye and loose every tongue. "Perhaps I should wait outside town," Noel suggested. Reading her tension, "No." The word came out firmer than she'd intended. "We do this together, as your father said. Besides, you waiting in the woods like an outlaw would only confirm their worst suspicions. And walking in beside you will not." Helen stopped and turned to face him. In the morning light, his features were sharply defined, the strong jaw, the scar across his eyebrow, the dark eyes that held both wariness and something else she didn't want to name. "Let them think what they will. They've been inventing stories about me for years. At least now they'll have something true to gossip about. That Helen Dawson helped a sick old man and his son during a blizzard. If they want to make that into something shameful, that's their failing, not ours." A smile ghosted across Noel's face. "You have warrior spirit, Helen Dawson." "I have stubborn spirit," she corrected. "Sometimes they look the same." They entered Cedar Ridge by the main street, their boots loud on the wooden sidewalks the townspeople had cleared of snow. The general store sat on the corner, its windows glowing warmly in the morning light. Helen could see figures moving inside, early shoppers and, no doubt, early gossips. The moment they pushed through the door, all conversation ceased. Helen counted 5 people besides Tom Garrett, the proprietor, Mrs. Abigail Morrison Samuel's wife, the widow Carson, young Billy Hartwell who worked as a stock boy, and inevitably, Martha Hendricks herself, holding court near the pickle barrel. "Well," Martha said, her voice cutting through the silence like a rusty blade. "Look what the storm blew in. Helen Dawson and a companion." Helen moved toward the counter with as much dignity as she could muster, intensely aware of Noel's solid presence behind her. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett. I need some supplies." Tom Garrett, a thin man who always looked like he'd bitten into something sour, glanced nervously between Helen and Noel. "Miss Dawson, didn't expect to see you in this weather." "The storm's passed," Helen said evenly. She pulled out her list. "I need these items, please, and whatever medicine you have for lung fever." "Medicine?" Martha stepped closer, her small eyes glittering with malicious curiosity. "Are you ill, Helen, or perhaps your guest?" Helen felt Noel tense behind her, but didn't turn. "That's my business, Mrs. Hendricks." "Nothing in this town is just your business," Martha snapped. especially when you bring one of them into our midst. Really, Helen, have you no shame, no consideration for decent folks? Decent folks. Helen's voice rose despite her resolve to stay calm. Decent folks would help anyone in need during a blizzard, not turn them away to freeze. Anyone. Martha's gaze raked over Noel with obvious disgust. That's no anyone. That's an Apache, a savage. Lord knows what he's done, what blood is on his hands. The only blood on my hands is from your friend's demon chicken, Noel said quietly. Speaking for the first time, Billy Hartwell made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, quickly turned into a cough when Martha glared at him. Tom Garrett busied himself gathering Helen's supplies, clearly wanting the transaction over quickly. I don't have much in the way of medicine, he said apologetically. Some laudanum, willow bark powder, a tonic Mrs. Chen makes. I'll take what you have. Helen said, You'll take nothing, a new voice announced from the doorway. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood there, his hand resting casually on his pistol. A big man running to fat. Pike had the kind of face that had probably been handsome before whiskey and meanness took their toll. Not until I understand what's happening here. I'm buying supplies, Helen said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal. Harboring fugitives is, Pike said, his pale eyes fixed on Noel. You, Apache, what's your name? What agency you from? Noel stood perfectly still, but Helen could feel the tension radiating from him. I am called Noel. We came from Fort Apache. Came from, you mean ran from? Pike stepped closer, and Helen caught the stale whiskey smell on his breath despite the early hour. Indians don't leave the reservation without papers. You got papers. We were told to leave, Noel said carefully. The agent said, I don't care what anybody said. No papers means you're a fugitive. And that makes Miss Dawson here guilty of harboring. That's ridiculous, Helen protested. They came to my door in a blizzard. His father is sick. What was I supposed to do? What any sensible white woman would do, Martha interjected. Bar the door and protect yourself. From what, an old man dying of lung fever? Helen's control finally snapped. You talk about Christian charity every Sunday, Martha Hendricks, but when it comes to actually showing any, you're as cold as yesterday's ashes. Martha's face flushed an ugly red. How dare you lecture me about Christianity when you're standing there bold as brass with a savage at your side? Everyone knows what you've been doing up in that cabin, living in sin, corrupting yourself with... That's enough. Noel's voice was quiet, but carried such authority that Martha actually stepped back. You will not speak to her that way. Pike's hand tightened on his pistol. You threatening white women now, boy? I am defending one, Noel replied, his gaze never leaving Pike's face. Though I wonder why that job falls to me when you wear the badge. The tension in the store ratcheted up another notch. Helen saw Tom Garrett ease toward the back room, and Billy Hartwell had gone pale as milk. Only Martha seemed energized by the confrontation, her eyes bright with anticipation of violence. Please, Abigail Morrison spoke up suddenly. Her voice was soft but firm. This isn't necessary. Helen, Samuel mentioned seeing smoke from your cabin. We were worried after the storm. I'm glad you're safe. The unexpected kindness nearly undid Helen's composure. She blinked hard against sudden tears. Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. We're fine. I just need these supplies, and we'll be on our way. Now hold on, Pike said. I haven't decided. Decided what, Sheriff? A new voice joined the conversation. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her small frame dwarfed by the large basket she carried. The Chinese laundress was one of the few people in town who treated Helen with consistent kindness, perhaps because she too knew the weight of being an outsider. Decided to arrest Miss Helen for Christian charity. This will look very good in newspapers. Yes, sheriff arrests woman for helping sick during blizzard. Very good for next election. Pike's face darkened. You stay out of this, Chinaman. This is American business. American business is my business. Mrs. Chen said calmly. I am American now. Citizen. I vote. My husband votes. All Chinese in town vote. You remember this, yes. It was a threat wrapped in silk, and everyone knew it. The Chinese community was small but cohesive, and they voted as a bloc. In a town where elections were often decided by a handful of votes, their support mattered. Tom Garrett seized the moment. Here are your supplies. Miss Dawson. He pushed a wrapped bundle across the counter. Including the medicines, that'll be $2. Helen knew it was less than cost. Tom's small act of defiance against the ugliness in his store. She paid quickly, and Noelle took the bundle before she could reach for it. We go now, Mrs. Chen announced. She looked at Noel with frank curiosity, but no hostility. I walk with you. I need to go same direction. It was a lie. The laundry was in the opposite direction, but Helen accepted the escort gratefully. They moved toward the door, but Pike stepped in front of them. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and threatening. I'll be checking with Fort Apache about runaways. If I find out you're lying, then you'll do your job, Helen said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Which would be a nice change from standing around threatening law-abiding citizens. Someone, she thought it might have been Billy Hartwell, made a strangled sound that might have been approval. Pike's face went nearly purple, but with Mrs. Chen watching and Abigail Morrison still present, he stepped aside. They made it 3 steps before Martha had to have the last word. Seems Helen Dawson's finally found a man desperate enough to have her. Pity it took a savage to warm her bed. Helen felt Noel stop, felt the gathering storm in his stillness. Without thinking, she placed her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath was iron-hard with tension. No, she said softly. She's not worth it. For a moment, she thought he might not listen. Then the tension eased slightly, and he allowed her to guide him out of the store. Mrs. Chen followed, closing the door firmly on Martha's continued vitriol. Outside, the cold air was like a blessing after the poisonous atmosphere of the store. They walked quickly, Mrs. Chen chattering about inconsequential things, the weather, her grandson's first tooth, the difficulty of getting good lye for soap. Her presence prevented any immediate pursuit, though Helen could feel eyes watching from windows. At the edge of town, Mrs. Chen stopped. I go back now, she announced. You be careful. Miss Helen, that sheriff, he is like dog with bone. Will not let go easy. Thank you, Helen said, meaning it deeply. For everything. Mrs. Chen studied Noel with shrewd eyes. You take care of her, she said. She has good heart, but sometimes not good sense. Helps everyone but herself. Noel inclined his head gravely. I understand. Good. Mrs. Chen smiled, transforming her stern face. You come to laundry next time. I give you good price. Apache or not, everyone needs clean clothes. She bustled away, leaving Helen and Noel alone on the snowy road. They walked in silence for several minutes, the town falling behind them as they began the climb back to the cabin. I'm sorry, Helen finally said. They were worse than usual. You have nothing to apologize for, Noel said. Their hatred is not your doing. No, but I brought you into it. If I'd gone alone, then they would have said worse things, and you would have faced them without support. He paused. That woman, Martha, she has hurt you before. It wasn't a question. Helen kicked at a snowdrift, watching the crystals scatter. She's the sheriff's sister-in-law. Thinks that gives her the right to judge everyone. She's been spreading stories about me since I refused her nephew's suit 4 years ago. He was a drunkard and a brute, but in her eyes, I should have been grateful for any offer. And the sheriff, he allows this. He encourages it. Pike's had his eye on my land for years. Thinks a woman alone can't manage it properly. If he could find legal cause to force me out? She shrugged. Making me miserable enough to leave voluntarily would suit him just as well. They climbed in silence for a while, the path steep enough to require concentration. But Helen was intensely aware of Noel beside her, of the controlled anger still simmering beneath his calm exterior. "What Mrs. Hendricks said," she began hesitantly. About why you're with me. I want you to know I don't think—" "I know what you think," Noel interrupted gently. "Just as you know what I think. Her poison cannot touch what is true." Helen's cheeks warmed despite the cold. "And what is true?" He stopped walking, turning to face her on the narrow path. "Truth is that you opened your door to strangers in need. Truth is that you show kindness without thought of reward. Truth is that you stood in that store and defended us when it would have been safer to stay silent." His voice softened. "Truth is that my father smiles when he speaks to you, and he has not smiled in many months." "He reminds me of my own father," Helen said, her throat tight. "Stubborn and wise and too proud to admit when he needs help." "Yes," Noel agreed. "But also he sees something in you. My father has always had the gift of seeing people's true hearts. It is why the agent feared him. He could not be fooled by false promises." They resumed walking, the cabin coming into view around the next bend. Smoke still rose from the chimney, a reassuring sign that all was well. "They'll make trouble for you now," Noel said. "The sheriff will not forget the insult." "Let him come," Helen said with more confidence than she felt. "I've done nothing wrong. Since when has that mattered to men like him?" It was a fair point. Helen thought of Pike's bloodshot eyes, of the barely leashed violence in his manner. He was a man who enjoyed having power over others, who took pleasure in fear and submission. Today she'd shown neither, and he wouldn't forgive that easily. As they approached the cabin, the door opened and White Feather appeared, leaning heavily on the doorframe but upright and alert. "Father," Noel rushed forward, "you should be resting." "I have rested enough," the old man said, though he allowed his son to help him back inside. "The spirits told me you would need strong medicine when you returned. And they were right. I can smell the town's hatred on you like smoke." Helen busied herself unpacking the supplies, trying not to think about the confrontation in the store. But her hands shook slightly as she measured out the medicine Tom Garrett had included. "Sit," White Feather commanded, gesturing to the chairs by the fire. "Both of you, tell me what happened." So they told him, taking turns relating the morning's events. White Feather listened without interruption, his weathered face grave. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This sheriff," he finally said, "he is the kind of man who must break what he cannot control. I have known many such men. They wear different faces, soldier, agent, settler, but their hearts are the same, small and frightened and cruel." "I'm not afraid of him," Helen said. "You should be," White Feather replied gently, not paralyzed with fear, but aware. "A cornered snake is dangerous, and you have cornered him with your defiance. What would you have had me do, bow my head and accept their insults?" "No." The old man smiled. "You did what a warrior does. You protected your people. Yes, your people. Do not look surprised. From the moment you opened that door, we became connected. This is the way of things." Noel made a sound of frustration. "Father, this is not our fight. We should leave as soon as you are able. We have brought enough trouble to her door." "And where would we go?" White Feather asked. "Back to the agency that cast us out south to Mexico, where we know no one, or shall we wander the mountains until the cold takes us?" He shook his head. "No, my son. Sometimes the spirits place us where we need to be, not where we think we want to go." Helen looked between father and son, seeing the conflict in Noel's face, the serene certainty in White Feather's. "You're welcome here as long as you need shelter," she said quietly. "Both of you." "You see," White Feather said to his son. "She understands. Home is not always where we are born. Sometimes it is where we are welcomed. The rest of the day passed quietly, but the morning's events cast a shadow. Helen found herself jumping at small sounds, watching the windows for unwelcome visitors. Noel was similarly alert, often stepping outside to scan the horizon. As evening fell and they shared another simple meal, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in her relationship with the town, that had been broken for years, but in her understanding of herself, of what she was willing to fight for. "You are troubled," Whitefeather observed as she cleared the dishes. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Chen said about having good heart but not good sense." Helen managed a wry smile. "She might be right." "The heart and the head rarely agree," the old man said. "But when forced to choose, I have found the heart's wisdom more reliable. The head tells us to be safe. The heart tells us to be human." Later, as they prepared for sleep, Noel caught her arm gently. "What my father said is true, but if you wish us to go, to spare you further trouble, we will understand." Helen looked up at him. This man who'd entered her life mere days ago but already felt essential to it. "Your father is right about something else too. Sometimes the spirits place us where we need to be. You needed shelter. I needed—" She paused, searching for words. "I needed to remember that I'm more than what this town has tried to make me." "You are much more," Noel said softly. "They are fools not to see it." That night, as Helen lay listening to the wind and the soft breathing of her guests, she thought about courage and kindness, about the price of standing up and the cost of backing down. Tomorrow, Pike would likely make good on his threats. The town's whispers would become shouts. But tonight, her cabin held warmth and companionship and something that felt like family. Whatever came next, she would not regret opening her door to two strangers in a storm. Some things were worth any price, even the wrath of Cedar Ridge and its small-minded sheriff. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, like a blessing rather than a curse. And in the darkness, three souls found shelter not just from the weather, but from a world that too often confused strength with cruelty and kindness with weakness. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they were safe, and that was enough. The snow continued for 3 more days, sealing them in a world of white silence. Helen had never minded being snowed in before. It was part of mountain life, as natural as breathing. But this time was different. This time, her small cabin held life and warmth and conversation that made the hours pass like minutes. Noel proved invaluable during their confinement. He repaired the loose shingles on the roof from inside the attic, patched the chinking between logs where cold air whistled through, and even fashioned new hinges for the cupboard door that had been hanging crooked for months. His hands were never idle, and Helen found herself watching them as he worked. Strong, capable hands that could create as easily as they could defend. Whitefeather, growing stronger each day, became the cabin's storyteller. He spoke of the old ways, teaching Helen Apache words for everyday things. She learned that gauche meant fire, tu meant water, and ni meant earth. But more than words, he taught her perspectives she'd never considered. "Your people see time as a straight line," he explained one afternoon as they sat by the fire. "Past behind, future ahead. But for Apache, time is a circle. What was, will be again. What is broken will mend. What is separated will reunite." "That's a comforting thought," Helen said, carefully mending a tear in one of Noel's shirts. "But some things, once broken, can't be fixed." "Cannot or will not," Whitefeather challenged gently. "Often we mistake one for the other." Noel looked up from the trap he was repairing. "Father believes everything has a purpose, even suffering." "And you don't?" Helen asked. "I believe suffering is suffering," Noel said quietly. "Purpose or not, It still cuts deep. The conversation turned to lighter things, but Helen noticed the way Whitefeather watched his son, concern creasing his weathered face. Later, when Noel went to check on the horses in the lean-to shelter, the old man spoke privately to Helen. "My son carries wounds you cannot see," he said. "He was married once. She died when the soldiers came to move us to the reservation. Shot by accident, they said, but there are no accidents in war, only choices and consequences." Helen's hand stilled on her mending. "How long ago?" "4 winters. He has not spoken her name since. Grief became anger. Anger became hardness. I feared his heart would turn to stone." Whitefeather smiled sadly. "But stones can crack when they meet the right force." Before Helen could ask what he meant, Noel returned, shaking snow from his hair. "The horses are well. Your shelter is better built than it looks." "My father knew how to build for these mountains," Helen said, grateful for the change of subject. "He said you had to work with the land, not against it." "A wise man," Noel agreed. He hesitated, then added, "There are tracks outside. A single rider circled the cabin yesterday, staying in the trees." Helen's stomach tightened. "Pike!" "Or one of his men. They did not approach, just watched." "Let them watch," Helen said with more bravado than she felt. "Looking isn't a crime." But they all knew it was more than looking. It was intimidation, a reminder that Helen's defiance hadn't been forgotten. That night, Noel insisted on keeping watch, positioning himself where he could see both windows and the door. On the 4th day, the snow finally stopped. The sun emerged, brilliant and blinding, turning the world into a crystal palace. Helen stepped outside to feed the chickens and gather eggs, breathing deeply of the clean, cold air. The red hen, true to form, pecked at her viciously before surrendering her eggs. "Still fighting the good fight, I see," Helen told the bird. "Good for you. Never give up." When she returned to the cabin, she found Whitefeather teaching Noel a complex pattern with string, something he called a spirit web. Their fingers moved in intricate coordination, creating geometric designs between their hands. "This was your grandmother's favorite," Whitefeather was saying. "She could make the stars dance in string." Helen watched, fascinated. As the pattern emerged, there was something deeply intimate about the scene, father passing knowledge to son, preserving traditions that might otherwise die. "Would you like to learn?" Whitefeather asked, noticing her attention. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "Knowledge shared is knowledge doubled," the old man said. "Come, I will show you the beginning pattern. Noel, help her see how the strings must cross." So Helen found herself sitting close to Noel, their hands occasionally touching as he guided her fingers through the movements. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, and his patience with her clumsy attempts touched her heart. "You're thinking too hard," he said when she tangled the pattern for the 3rd time. "Feel the rhythm. Don't force it." "Easy for you to say," Helen muttered. "You've been doing this since childhood." "Actually, I was terrible at it as a child," Noel admitted. "My sister was the one with clever fingers. She would laugh at my attempts." It was the first time he'd mentioned family beyond his father. Helen wanted to ask more, but sensed the memory was fragile, not to be probed. They passed the afternoon in such gentle pursuits, string patterns, stories, the comfortable silences that had grown between them. As evening approached, Whitefeather dozed in his chair while Helen prepared their meal. Noel helped, their movements in the small kitchen space now practiced and smooth. "The storm is over," Noel said quietly as they worked. "We should leave tomorrow." Helen's hands paused in kneading biscuit dough. "Your father is stronger, but he's not ready for hard travel." "He is ready enough. We have imposed too long." "You haven't imposed at all," Helen said firmly. "You've helped more than anyone has in years." "That is not why we helped." "I know," she resumed kneading, putting more force than necessary into it. But this isn't about debts or payments. Your father still needs rest and proper food. The trail south is treacherous even in good weather. And staying brings more danger to your door. The rider yesterday was just looking. Helen interrupted. Pike's trying to scare me. If he had legal grounds to act, he would have already. Noel moved closer, his voice urgent. Men like him don't need legal grounds. They make their own law. Then running won't help, will it? Helen turned to face him, flour-dusted hands planted on her hips. If he's determined to cause trouble, he'll do it whether you're here or gone. At least if you're here. What? Noel's eyes searched hers. What do you gain from our presence except danger? Helen wanted to say so many things, that she gained laughter and warmth and the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years, that she gained purpose beyond mere survival, that watching him with his father reminded her of what family meant. Instead, she said simply, I gain friends. That's worth any risk. Something shifted in Noel's expression, a softening that made him look younger. Helen, the biscuits will burn, she said quickly, turning back to the stove. Her cheeks felt warm, and not from the heat of cooking. That evening, as they ate their meal of venison stew and fresh biscuits, White Feather entertained them with the story of Coyote and the Stars. His voice rose and fell with dramatic flair, and even Noel smiled at the funny parts. Helen found herself laughing at Coyote's foolish attempts to steal the stars for his own tent. But why did Coyote keep trying when he failed every time? She asked. Because that is Coyote's nature, White Feather explained. He cannot help but reach for what is beautiful, even when it burns his paws. In this, he is very human. After dinner, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. Helen worked on her mending while the men talked quietly in Apache. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was serious, occasionally heated. Finally, Noel stood abruptly and went outside. He struggles, White Feather said into the sudden silence. His heart and his head war with each other. About leaving. About many things. The old man studied her with those penetrating eyes. You know my son has feelings for you? Helen's needle slipped, pricking her finger. We barely know each other. The heart does not keep calendars, White Feather said gently. It knows what it knows. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Nothing, Helen said firmly. He's been kind to me, that's all. When you leave. If we leave? When you leave, Helen repeated. Life will go back to how it was. That's how it has to be. White Feather made a sound that might have been disappointment or understanding. You are both so determined to be unhappy. It would be amusing if it were not so sad. Noel returned then, bringing cold air and the scent of snow. He avoided looking at either of them, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. The comfortable atmosphere had shifted, tension crackling like static before a storm. As they prepared for sleep, Helen noticed Noel's bedroll had been moved closer to the door, a defensive position. Whatever he'd seen or thought about outside had increased his worry. She wanted to ask, but sensed his mood was too dark for questions. That night, Helen lay awake listening to the small sounds of the cabin. White Feather's improved breathing, the fire settling, wind testing the windows. But underneath the familiar sounds was something else, a waiting quality that made her restless. Near midnight, she heard Noel rise and move silently to the window. She could see his silhouette against the faint moonlight, tense and watchful. What is it? She whispered. He turned, perhaps surprised she was awake. Nothing certain, just a feeling. Helen rose and joined him at the window, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The moon turned the snowy landscape into a scene of stark beauty, all silver light and black shadow. I've lived here 7 years, she said softly. I know when something's wrong. Tell me. Noel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, there were more tracks today. 3, maybe 4 riders. They stayed back, but they're watching, planning. Planning what? Nothing good. He turned from the window to look at her. In the moonlight, his face was all planes and angles. I should not have let you go to town. Should not have let them see us together. Let me. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Helen felt a spark of indignation. I don't recall asking your permission. A smile ghosted across his face. No, you do not ask anyone's permission. It is one of your strengths. Also, one of your dangers. They stood close in the darkness, the few inches between them feeling both vast and insignificant. Helen was intensely aware of his presence, of the controlled power in his stillness, of the way his eyes never left her face. I'm not afraid, she said. I know. That frightens me more than anything. Without thinking, Helen reached up and touched the scar on his cheekbone. How did you get this? Noel went very still, but didn't pull away. A soldier's bayonet. I was 15, trying to protect my sister. I failed. What happened to her? She lived. Married a white man who promised to keep her safe. Haven't seen her in 6 years. She's Sarah Morrison now. Lives in California. Pretends to be Mexican to avoid the shame of Apache blood. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Helen heard it anyway. I'm sorry. Don't be. She survived. That's what matters. Is it? Helen challenged softly. Surviving isn't the same as living. Says the woman who's been hiding on this mountain for 7 years. The words should have stung, but the gentleness in his tone robbed them of hurt. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting. For what? Helen didn't have an answer. Or rather, she had one but couldn't voice it. How could she say she'd been waiting for someone who would see her as more than the town spinster? More than poor Helen Dawson who couldn't catch a husband? How could she explain that she'd been waiting for someone who would make her cabin feel like a home instead of a refuge? I don't know, she said finally. Maybe for a storm to blow strangers to my door. Noel's hand came up to cover hers where it still rested against his face. Helen, when this is over... A sound outside made them both freeze. Horses, moving fast through the snow. Noel pushed Helen behind him and grabbed the rifle from its pegs. Wake my father, he said tersely. Quietly. But Whitefeather was already awake, sitting up with the alertness of a man who'd spent his life in danger. How many? 3, maybe 4, Noel answered, checking the rifle's load. Coming fast. The horses stopped just beyond the clearing. Helen's heart pounded as she heard muffled voices, the creak of saddle leather. Then, shockingly loud in the quiet night. Helen Dawson, this is Sheriff Pike. Open up, I have a warrant for the arrest of the Apache fugitives you're harboring. Helen started toward the door, but Noel caught her arm. No, make him come to us. What do you want? Sheriff, Helen called through the door. It's the middle of the night. Open this door or we'll break it down. Pike's voice was slurred slightly. He'd been drinking. You've got 1 minute. He has no warrant, Whitefeather said calmly. No judge would sign such a paper without cause. He lies. I know, Helen said. She looked between the 2 men who'd brought such unexpected change to her life. Whatever happens, follow my lead. This is my land, my fight. Helen, Noel began. Trust me, she said, then lifted the bar and opened the door. Pike stood on her porch, flanked by 3 men she recognized as some of the town's worst elements. Jack Curry, who'd been run out of 2 counties for cattle rustling, Ben Thompson, who beat his wife so badly she'd fled back east, and Will Hartley, who spent more time in the saloon than out of it. Not exactly a legal posse. Where's this warrant? Helen demanded. Pike's bloodshot eyes narrowed. Don't get smart with me, woman. We know you've got them savages in there. I have 2 guests who sought shelter from the storm, Helen said evenly. Since when is hospitality a crime? Since they're fugitive Indians, Pike snarled. He tried to push past her, but Helen stood firm in the doorway. You can't enter without a warrant. That's the law. I am the law. Pike's face was ugly with rage and whiskey. And I say— He stopped mid-sentence as Noel appeared behind Helen, the rifle held casually but ready. White Feather joined them, dignified despite his obvious frailty. Ah, Pike said with satisfaction. The fugitives show themselves. We are not fugitives, White Feather said with quiet authority. We were expelled from the agency for speaking truth. Is truth now illegal in America? You're off the reservation without papers. Pike said, That's all I need to know. Then arrest us, Noel challenged. Take us to a real judge, not your kangaroo court. Let the law decide. Pike's hand moved to his gun. Maybe you'll try to escape. Maybe I'll have to stop you, permanent-like. The threat hung in the cold air. Helen felt Noel tense behind her, ready to act. But it was White Feather who spoke, his voice carrying a power that made everyone pause. You come in darkness like cowards. You bring whiskey courage and men of poor reputation. You threaten women and elders. Is this your white man's justice? He stepped forward, and despite his age and illness, there was something magnificent about him. I have lived long and seen much. I have watched your people break every promise, take every sacred thing. But still I believed some whites had honor. Was I wrong? For a moment, even Pike seemed affected by the old man's dignity. Then he shook it off, his face hardening. Pretty words won't save you, old man. He looked at Helen. Last chance, hand them over, or share their fate. Then I share their fate, Helen said clearly. And tomorrow, the whole town will know how the sheriff came like a thief in the night, drunk and without legal authority, threatening a woman and two men who've done nothing but survive a storm. Who'll tell them you? Pike laughed unpleasantly. You won't be in any condition to tell anyone anything. The click of Noel cocking the rifle was loud in the silence. You touch her, you die. Simple as that. Pike's men shifted nervously. They'd come for easy prey, not a real fight. Jack Curry especially looked uncomfortable. He was a coward at heart, brave only when the odds were overwhelmingly in his favor. Big talk from a savage, Pike said, but Helen heard the first note of uncertainty. You shoot a white lawman, they'll hang you for sure. Maybe, Noel agreed. But you'll be too dead to enjoy it. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Helen could hear her heart beating, could feel the cold seeping through her thin nightdress. Someone would break soon, either Pike's whiskey courage or his men's weak loyalty. It was White Feather who broke it, but not in the way anyone expected. The old man suddenly swayed, his hand going to his chest. My heart, he gasped, and collapsed. Father, Noel caught him as he fell, the rifle forgotten. Helen dropped to her knees beside them, feeling for a pulse. He's alive, she said, but his heart's racing like a rabbit's. We need to get him inside. For a moment, humanity warred with cruelty on Pike's face. Then he stepped back. Get him inside then. But this isn't over. You've got 3 days. Then I come back with a real posse and proper papers. 3 days to get these savages off your land, or I'll arrest all 3 of you. He turned and stomped off the porch, his men following with obvious relief. Helen and Noel carried White Feather inside and laid him on his pallet. The old man's eyes fluttered open as Helen bathed his face with cool water. Did they leave? He whispered. Yes, Helen said. Rest now. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Sometimes weakness is stronger than strength. They could face guns, but not an old man's failing heart. Noel made a sound between a laugh and a sob. You scared us. I scared myself, White Feather admitted. But only a little. The heart truly did race. Too much excitement for these old bones. They spent the rest of the night tending him, taking turns watching both White Feather and the windows. No one slept. As dawn painted the mountains pink and gold, Helen made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. 3 days, Noel said quietly as they stood by the window. He means it. I know. Helen wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. But 3 days is time to think, to plan. Plan what we cannot fight the whole town. Maybe we don't have to, Helen said. Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Chen, Tom Garrett, not everyone in Cedar Ridge is like Pike. Maybe it's time to remind them that they have a choice too. And if they choose Pike, Helen looked at Whitefeather, sleeping peacefully now, his breathing steady. She thought of the string patterns he'd taught her, the stories he'd shared, the way he called her daughter. She looked at Noel, who'd worked beside her, protected her, made her feel less alone than she'd been in 7 years. Then we face that together too, she said simply. Whatever comes, we face it together. Noel was quiet for a long moment. Then he took the coffee cup from her hands and set it aside, taking her hands in his. They were warm and calloused and gentle. You could leave, he said. Go to another town. Start over where no one knows you took in Apaches. You have 3 days to save yourself. I spent 7 years saving myself, Helen replied. Hidden away up here, safe and alone and slowly dying inside. I'm done with that kind of saving. Even if it means real danger, even if Pike makes good on his threats. Even then, she squeezed his hands. Some things are worth the risk. Your father was right. I've been mistaking cannot for will not for too long. The sun climbed higher, flooding the cabin with golden light. Outside, the snow sparkled like scattered diamonds. It was a beautiful morning, despite everything. Or perhaps because of everything. The ugliness of the night had clarified things, burning away pretense and leaving only truth. 3 days. 3 days to find a solution or face the consequences. 3 days to decide if the town had any conscience left to appeal to. 3 days to admit what had been growing between her and Noel since that first night when he'd knocked on her door. It wasn't much time, but then again, Helen reflected, it had only taken one storm to change everything. Maybe 3 days would be enough for another miracle. Whitefeather stirred and opened his eyes. Good morning, my children, he said, seeing them standing together. The sun rises on a new day. What will we make of it? Helen looked at Noel, then at the old man who'd become like family in just a few days. Whatever we need to, she said. Whatever we need to. The first of the 3 days dawned cold and clear. Helen stood at her window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered mountains gold behind her. She could hear Noel helping his father with morning preparations. The domestic sounds that had become so comforting now carried an undertone of urgency. You're going to town, Noel said. It wasn't a question. Helen turned from the window. I have to try. Some people there are good folk who've just been silent too long. Maybe if I talk to them directly. It's too dangerous. Pike will be watching for you. Pike will be sleeping off his whiskey until noon, Helen countered. Besides, I know the back trails. I can get to the Morrisons without going through the main street. Whitefeather spoke from his chair. She is right to try. Words before weapons, always. But daughter. He fixed her with those knowing eyes. Do not go alone. I can't take Noel. That would play right into Pike's hands. Not my son. Take your strength. Take your truth. But also take something else. The old man reached into his worn pouch and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft leather. This was my wife's. A woman of courage should carry the blessing of another woman of courage. Helen unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small silver medallion, worn smooth with age, engraved with symbols she didn't recognize. It's beautiful, she breathed. It is protection, Whitefeather said simply. Not from bullets or hate, but from losing yourself in the face of others' darkness. Helen fastened the medallion inside her coat, feeling its weight against her heart. Thank you. She left within the hour, taking the old deer trail that wound around the mountain's shoulder. The path was treacherous with snow, but she knew every root and rock. As she walked, she planned her words, her appeals to conscience and community. The Morrison homestead sat in a gentle valley, smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. Helen approached carefully, relieved to see Samuel in the barn, alone. "Helen." He straightened from mucking stalls, surprise clear on his weathered face. "Heard there was some trouble at your place last night." "News travels fast," Helen said dryly. Samuel's expression grew troubled. "Pike came by this morning, early, recruiting for a posse. Said you were harboring dangerous fugitives." "I'm sheltering a sick old man and his son who got caught in the storm." "Since when is that a crime?" "Since Pike decided to make it one." Samuel set aside his pitchfork. His honest face creased with worry. "Helen, I've known you since you were knee-high. You're good people. But this, harboring Apaches, it's got folks stirred up." "Stirred up by lies," Helen said hotly. "They're not criminals. Samuel, the old man spoke up about cut rations at the agency. For that, they were thrown out in a blizzard." Samuel rubbed his jaw, a gesture she remembered from her childhood when he was thinking hard. "That don't sound right. But Helen, right or wrong don't matter much when Pike's got his mind set. And after what happened to the Pemberton family over in Miller's Creek." "What happened?" "Apaches raided their homestead, killed everyone except the youngest boy. Found him hiding in the root cellar 3 days later, half dead from cold." Samuel's voice was heavy. "Now, I'm not saying all Apaches are raiders, but folks are scared. Fear makes them listen to men like Pike." Helen's heart sank. She hadn't heard about the Pemberton raid. It would make her task infinitely harder. "These aren't those Apaches," she said firmly. "Whitefeather is a grandfather who tells stories and makes string figures. Noel has done nothing but help repair my cabin and protect us from Pike's drunken threats. They deserve justice, not mob violence." "Maybe so," Samuel said slowly. "But Helen, you gotta understand, Pike's been building support all morning. He's got Jack Curry saying you pulled a gun on them. Ben Thompson's claiming the Apaches threatened to burn the town. Will Hartley's so drunk he'd swear to anything for another bottle. And people believe them Curry's a thief, Thompson's a brute, and Hartley hasn't drawn a sober breath in years. People believe what they want to believe when they're scared." Samuel looked toward his house where Abigail could be seen through the kitchen window. "I got my own family to think of. Helen, I can't go against the whole town." The words hit Helen like a physical blow. Samuel had been her father's friend, had helped bury both her parents. If he wouldn't help... "I'm not asking you to go against anyone," she said, fighting to keep desperation from her voice. "Just don't join Pike's posse. Stay neutral. That's all." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Abigail likes you," he finally said. "Always has. Says you remind her of her sister back east. Too smart for your own good, but with a kind heart." He sighed deeply. "I won't ride with Pike. Can't promise more than that. But I won't be part of a mob." It was something, at least. Helen thanked him and left, taking a circuitous route to the Chen Laundry. The small building sat on the edge of town, separated from the respectable businesses by an invisible line of prejudice. Mrs. Chen was alone, stirring a vast pot of steaming water. Her face lit up when she saw Helen. "Miss Helen, I worry after yesterday. That sheriff, he is like dog with bone." "More like a rabid dog," Helen said tiredly. "Mrs. Chen, I need help. Pike's forming a posse. He's given me 3 days to send my guests away, but I don't think he'll wait that long." Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. "I know about mobs. In California, before we come here, mob burn our shop. Say Chinese steal white man's work. We lose everything. Start over here." She stirred the pot with sharp, angry movements. "Sheriff Pike, same as those men. Use fear to make hate. Use hate to take what he wants." "What does he want?" "Your land. Maybe power. Certainly. But mostly. He want everyone to fear him. You not fear him. This make him crazy." Helen sank onto a wooden crate, suddenly exhausted. I don't know what to do. I can't abandon White Feather and Noel, but I can't fight the whole town. Mrs. Chen abandoned her stirring and sat beside Helen. You know story of David and Goliath? Of course. Everyone remembered David half stone, but real weapon was faith. Faith that right stronger than might. She patted Helen's hand. You have faith. I'm trying to... Try harder. Also, practical help. My husband's cousin is lawyer in Denver. He know Indian law. I already send message. Maybe he come, maybe not, but law is bigger than Sheriff Pike. Hope stirred in Helen's chest. A real lawyer. Real lawyer. Fight for Chinese rights, Indian rights. Anybody rights who pay or who need help. Mrs. Chen smiled slyly. Also, I talk to other Chinese families. We remember who help us, who hurt us. Election come every 2 years. Sheriff Pike maybe learned votes matter more than guns. Helen hugged the small woman impulsively. Thank you. No thank needed. You stand in store yesterday. Defend Apache men when no one else speak. This I don't forget. Mrs. Chen's expression grew serious. But Helen, be careful. Pike not stupid, just mean he make plan too. Helen left through the back door. Hood pulled up to hide her face. She'd done what she could in town. Now she needed to get back before Pike noticed her absence. She was halfway up the mountain when she heard horses behind her, heart pounding. She ducked behind a cluster of boulders, pressing herself against the cold stone. The riders came into view, Jack Curry and 2 men she didn't recognize, all armed. Said to check the North Trail. One was saying, see if she tries to sneak them out that way. Waste of time. Curry grumbled. Should just burn her out. Be done with it. Pike said wait. Wants it legal-like. Curry spat. Legal? Since when does Pike care about legal? He just wants to drag it out. Make her sweat. They passed within 20 feet of Helen's hiding spot. She held her breath. White Feather's medallion pressed between her palm and the rock. Only when the hoofbeats faded did she emerge, shaking. The rest of the journey was tense, every sound making her jump. But she reached the cabin without further incident. Noel met her at the door, rifle in hand, relaxing only when he saw her. Trouble, he asked, reading her face. Pike's got men watching the trails, and there was a raid over in Miller's Creek. Apaches killed a family. The timing couldn't be worse. Noel's expression darkened. Always there are raids when it's convenient. Always Apaches to blame when fear is needed. You think it wasn't real? Oh, it was real. But who did it? Renegades, white men dressed as Apache happens more than you think. Dead families can't say who really killed them. White Feather listened as Helen recounted her morning. When she finished, he nodded slowly. The Morrison man shows wisdom. Neutrality is sometimes all we can ask, and the Chinese woman understands. She has walked this path. It's not enough, Noel said harshly. A lawyer who might come a few votes 2 years away. Pike won't give us that time. Then we make our own time, White Feather said calmly. Daughter, in your father's things, are there documents, papers that prove this land is yours? Yes, the deed, the claim papers. Why? Because a law is stronger when written down. If this sheriff wants legal, we give him legal. My son knows white man's law. He studied it at the agency school before they closed it. Noel looked surprised. That was years ago, Father. Knowledge doesn't expire. You read their books, learned their rules. Use it now. Helen fetched her father's document box, and they spent the afternoon going through papers. Noel's education proved broader than Helen had expected. He read through complex legal documents with understanding, making notes with her pen. Your claim is solid, he finally said, and there's nothing in territorial law that forbids harboring travelers, Indian or otherwise. Pike is exceeding his authority. But who'll stand up to tell him that? Helen asked. We will, Noel said simply. With papers and witnesses. Make it public, official. Force him to act in daylight, not darkness. That evening, as they shared what might be their last peaceful meal together, White Feather told another story. This one was about a mouse who stood up to an eagle, using cleverness instead of strength. The eagle could crush the mouse easily, he said, but the mouse knew something the eagle didn't, that all the other small creatures were watching. If the mouse showed courage, they might too, and many mice together can defeat one eagle. Is that how the story ends? Helen asked. The mice winning. White Feather smiled. Stories end how we make them end. That is the power of being human. We can change the story. Later, as Helen prepared for bed, Noel stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. He seemed to struggle for words. These days with you, they've been like waking up after a long sleep. My father says I've been dead inside since my wife died. But here, with you, I feel alive again. Helen's throat tightened. Noel, let me finish. If Pike comes tomorrow, if things go bad, I need you to promise something. Take my father and run. The North Trail leads to... No. Helen placed her fingers over his lips, stopping the words. We stand together or not at all. That's not negotiable. He caught her hand, holding it against his face. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man, she countered. We're well matched. For a moment, the space between them hummed with possibility. Then White Feather coughed, breaking the spell, and they separated. That night, Helen lay awake planning. Misses. Chen was right. Faith was her weapon. Faith that right would prevail, that the town's conscience wasn't completely dead, that love was stronger than hate. Tomorrow would test that faith. She thought of the Pemberton family, killed in their home, of the fear that would generate, the anger Pike would channel. But she also thought of Mrs. Chen's courage, of Samuel's reluctant neutrality, of Tom Garrett's small kindness with the supplies. Not everyone in Cedar Ridge had surrendered to Pike's vision of justice. The second day of their 3-day reprieve would dawn soon. Time was running like water through her fingers, but as she finally drifted toward sleep, Helen felt strangely calm. Whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. An old Apache storyteller and his warrior son had changed her story. Now it was time to see how it would end. White Feather's medallion lay warm against her skin, a reminder of another woman who'd chosen freedom over safety. Outside, an owl called, and the wind sang through the pines. The mountain kept its ancient watch, indifferent to human struggles but offering its own form of strength to those who knew how to listen. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight, in a small cabin on a Colorado mountain, 3 souls had created their own definition of family, of home, of belonging. And that, Helen thought as sleep finally took her, was worth any price Pike and his mob might demand. The story was still being written, and Helen Mae Dawson, who'd been alone for so long, finally understood that the best stories were those written together, with courage, faith, and the kind of love that grows in the most unlikely places, like a flower blooming in snow, fragile but all the more beautiful for its improbability. The second day was coming. The eagle was circling, but the mouse, 3 mice, actually were ready to show that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can change everything. The second day arrived with an ominous red sunrise that painted the snow like blood. Helen woke to find Noel already outside, scanning the tree line with grim intensity. White Feather sat at the table, calmly writing on the paper Helen had provided. "What are you writing?" she asked, pouring coffee with hands that wanted to shake. "Truth," the old man replied. "My testimony, who we are, why we left the agency, what happened here. Truth is a weapon too, if wielded properly." Before Helen could respond, Noel burst through the door. "Riders coming, many of them!" Helen's heart plummeted. It was only the second day. Pike had promised 3, but promises meant nothing to men like him. How many? Whitefeather asked. Still writing. 15, maybe 20. Pike leads them. Noel checked the rifle, his movements swift and economical. They're taking their time, making sure we see them coming. Helen looked out the window. The posse was indeed visible, spreading out in a wide line as they approached. She recognized many faces. Some she'd expected, like Jack Curry and Ben Thompson, but others surprised her. Tom Garrett from the general store, young Billy Hartwell, even Pastor Williams, though he stayed well back. "So much for Christian charity," she muttered, seeing the pastor. "Fear makes cowards of many," Whitefeather said. He finished writing and carefully folded the paper. "Keep this safe, daughter, whatever happens." The riders stopped just beyond rifle range. Pike rode forward alone, his sheriff's badge glinting in the morning sun. He looked sober this time, which made him more dangerous. "Helen Dawson," his voice carried clearly across the snow. "By the authority vested in me as sheriff of this county, I'm here to arrest the Apache fugitives you're harboring. Send them out now, and no harm will come to you." Helen stepped onto the porch, grateful for the solid wall at her back. "You said 3 days. Sheriff, it's only been 2. "That was before we got word from Fort Apache." Pike called back. "These Indians are wanted for theft, assault on an agency official, and inciting rebellion. They're dangerous criminals, and you're harboring them." "Lies," Noel said quietly from behind her. "We took nothing, touched no one. Speaking truth is not rebellion." "Then come out and tell that to a judge," Pike challenged. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to fear from the law." Whitefeather appeared in the doorway, dignified despite his obvious frailty. "Your law?" he asked, his voice carrying surprising power. "The law that starves women and children, the law that takes our land, our language, our names, that law I do not recognize." A murmur ran through the posse. Some men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "You see," Pike turned to address his men. "Defiance, rejection of American authority, and this woman stands with them against her own people." "I stand with justice," Helen said clearly. "With humanity. If that puts me against you, Sheriff, then maybe you should ask yourself what side you're really on." "Brave words," Pike sneered. "Let's see how brave you are when—" "Sheriff Pike," a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see a rider approaching fast from the direction of town. As he drew closer, Helen recognized Samuel Morrison. Samuel Pike looked irritated. "What are you doing here?" Samuel reined in his horse, breathing hard. "Stopping a mistake. There's a U.S. Marshal on his way from Denver. Got word this morning. He's coming to investigate complaints about the Fort Apache agency. These men," he gestured to Noel and Whitefeather, "are wanted as witnesses, not criminals." The posse stirred restlessly. A U.S. Marshal was federal authority, outranking any county sheriff. "That's convenient," Pike said suspiciously. "Who sent for a marshal?" "The Chinese lawyer Mrs. Chen contacted," Samuel said. "Turns out he's got connections in high places. The marshal will be here by nightfall." Helen felt a spark of hope. Mrs. Chen had worked even faster than promised. But Pike wasn't ready to back down. Marshal or no marshal, these Indians are trespassing on white land. That's still a crime. "Actually, it's not." Another unexpected voice joined the conversation. Tom Garrett urged his horse forward, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I looked it up last night in the territorial statutes. Miss Dawson owns this land free and clear. She can host whoever she pleases." "You're taking their side now. Garrett," Pike's voice was dangerous. "I'm taking the law's side," Tom said firmly. "The real law, not whatever you make up when it suits you." More murmuring from the posse. Helen saw several men exchange glances, doubt creeping into their faces. "You're all fools," Pike snarled. "These savages killed the Pemberton family. No, another voice said. Pastor Williams moved his horse forward, his thin face troubled. I've been praying on this all night. Sheriff, these men were documented at the agency 4 days before the Pemberton raid. They couldn't have been there. The mood of the posse was shifting. Helen could feel it like a change in the wind. Men who'd come for easy violence were facing complicated truths. Enough talk. Jack Curry spurred his horse forward. We came here to do a job. Are we going to let a woman and 2 Indians make fools of us? We came here to uphold the law, Samuel Morrison said sharply, not to become a lynch mob. Same thing sometimes, Ben Thompson growled. No, Whitefeather said, stepping fully onto the porch. It is never the same thing. I have lived long enough to see both true justice and mob rule. One builds civilization, the other destroys it. Pretty words from a savage. Curry sneered. I am Apache, Whitefeather said with quiet pride. I am father, grandfather, keeper of stories. I have loved, lost, endured. What are you, besides a man who follows another man's hatred? Curry's face flushed. He reached for his gun, but Tom Garrett's voice cracked like a whip. Draw that weapon, Jack, and you'll answer to the marshal for it. The tension stretched taut. Helen felt Noel tense beside her, ready to act if violence erupted, but it was young Billy Hartwell who broke the standoff in an unexpected way. I ain't shooting nobody's grandfather, he announced, wheeling his horse around. This ain't what I signed up for. He rode away without looking back. His departure created a crack in the posse's unity. 2 more men followed, then another. Soon, only the hardcore remained. Pike, Curry, Thompson, and a handful of others. Cowards! Pike shouted after the departing riders. You'll regret this. The only thing I regret, Pastor Williams said sadly, is not speaking up sooner. Mrs. Hendricks has been spreading poison about Miss Dawson for years, and I stayed silent. No more. He looked directly at Helen. I'm sorry, Miss Dawson. A man of God should know better than to let gossip flourish like weeds. He too turned and rode away, leaving Pike with less than a third of his original force. This isn't over, Pike said, his voice low and venomous. Marshal or no marshal, you can't watch your backs forever. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Samuel asked mildly. In front of all these witnesses. Pike's face contorted with rage, but he had enough self-preservation to hold his tongue. We're leaving, he ground out. But this isn't finished. The remnants of the posse wheeled and followed their leader, Jack Curry turning to spit in the snow as a final insult. Helen stayed on the porch until they were out of sight. Then her knees nearly buckled. Noel caught her arm, steadying her. You did well. Very well. We all did, Helen said shakily. But Pike's right. This isn't over. No, Whitefeather agreed. But the story has changed. The mouse showed courage, and some of the other creatures took notice. This is how avalanches begin, with one small stone moving. Samuel Morrison had remained behind. He dismounted and approached the porch, hat in hand. Miss Dawson, I owe you an apology. I should have stood up from the start. You stood up when it mattered, Helen said. That took courage. Took shame, more like. Samuel admitted. Abigail gave me an earful last night. Said if I let Pike railroad innocent folks, she'd never forgive me. He looked at Noel and Whitefeather. I don't know you men, but Helen Dawson's a good judge of character. If she says you're worth protecting, that's enough for me. Thank you, Whitefeather said gravely. Your wife is wise. Listen to her. Samuel smiled. Been married 23 years. I've learned that much. His expression grew serious. The marshal really is coming. Should be here by sunset. But Pike won't give up easy. He's got too much pride invested now. And greed, Helen added. He's always wanted this land. Then we must be ready. Noel said, for whatever comes. Samuel left, promising to keep watch in town and send warning if Pike made any moves. The cabin felt strangely quiet after all the shouting and posturing. Helen made fresh coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. "I thought they were going to shoot," she admitted. "So did I," Noel said. "But you stood firm. That changed everything." "We stood firm," Helen corrected. "All of us." Whitefeather smiled. "See how the story changes? This morning we were 3 people alone against many. Now we have allies. The Morrison man, the shopkeeper, even the holy man found his conscience." "But Pike still has men," Helen pointed out. "Violent men. Fewer than before," Noel said. "And now they know others are watching. Violence is easier in darkness. Light makes cowards hesitate." They spent the afternoon preparing for the marshal's arrival. Whitefeather's written testimony was supplemented with Helen's account and Noel's careful documentation of their expulsion from the agency. They had truth on their side. But would it be enough? As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they heard horses approaching once more. Helen's heart raced, but Noel, watching from the window, relaxed. One rider, alone, wearing a federal badge. The marshal was younger than Helen had expected, with intelligent eyes and a neat mustache. He introduced himself as James McBride and accepted Helen's offer of coffee gratefully. "Cold ride from Denver," he said, warming his hands on the cup. "Now, suppose you folks tell me what's been happening here." They told him everything: the storm, the shelter, Pike's threats, the attempted arrest that morning. McBride listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small book. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I've been investigating Fort Apache agency for months," he finally said. "Reports of stolen supplies, cut rations, Indians dying of starvation while beef meant for them gets sold to local ranchers. These men," he nodded to Noel and Whitefeather, "are indeed wanted as witnesses. Their testimony could help clean up that cesspool." "Will you protect them?" Helen asked. "I'll do better than that. I'll deputize them. Make them official federal witnesses. Anyone who threatens them will be threatening the United States government." He smiled grimly. "Even Sheriff Pike isn't fool enough to take on federal authority directly." "You don't know Pike," Noel said darkly. "No, but I know his type. Bullies who use their badge to settle personal scores. There's going to be some changes in Cedar Ridge. I think, starting with a close look at the sheriff's activities." As if summoned by his name, Pike appeared at the edge of the clearing, but this time he was alone. He rode forward slowly, hands visible. "Marshal McBride," he called. "Heard you were here." "Sheriff Pike." McBride stepped onto the porch. "I understand there's been some trouble." "Just trying to do my job," Pike said, attempting a reasonable tone. "These Indians were off the reservation without papers. These men are federal witnesses in my custody," McBride said coolly. "Any interference with them is a federal crime. Are we clear?" Pike's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Clear. Good. Oh, and Sheriff, I'll be staying in town for a few days, looking into various matters. I trust you'll cooperate fully." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Pike nodded stiffly and rode away without another word. "He won't forget this," Noel said quietly. "Neither will I." McBride replied, "Men like Pike depend on isolation, on their victims having nowhere to turn. But now you have federal protection. And Miss Dawson," he turned to Helen, "you've shown remarkable courage. Not many would stand up to a corrupt sheriff and his mob." "I had help," Helen said, looking at Noel and Whitefeather. "I wasn't alone." "No," Whitefeather said softly. "None of us are alone. This is the lesson. Separation is the lie. Connection is the truth." As darkness fell, McBride departed for town, promising to return in the morning to take official statements. The crisis had passed, at least for now. Pike was defanged, his posse scattered, his authority challenged. But as Helen prepared their evening meal, She knew this victory was temporary. Pike's kind didn't accept defeat easily. He would look for another way to strike, another moment of vulnerability. "You're worried," Noel observed, helping her with the dishes. Pike's still out there, still dangerous, but no longer unopposed. Noel reminded her, "Today showed that there are good people in Cedar Ridge. They just needed someone to remind them of their courage."
"Is that what I did?"
Noel touched her face gently. "You stood between us and 20 armed men. You faced down hatred with dignity. Yes, you reminded them of courage. You reminded me too. Of courage. Of many things, that there is still good in this world, that kindness exists, that a heart can heal, even after great loss." His thumb traced her cheekbone.
"My wife would have liked you. She had the same spirit, fierce and gentle at once."
It was the first time he'd spoken of his wife directly. Helen covered his hand with hers. "Tell me about her." So he did, speaking quietly of a young woman who laughed easily, who could track deer better than any man, who died protecting children during the forced march to the reservation. Helen listened, understanding this was a gift, the sharing of a treasured memory.
"She sounds wonderful,"
Helen said when he finished.
"She was, but she's gone, and I cannot live in the past forever. My father is right. I've been dead inside too long."
He looked at her intently. "You brought me back to life. Helen, whatever happens next, I need you to know that." Before Helen could respond, Whitefeather spoke from his chair. "The Marshal offers us protection, but also obligation. We must go to Denver, testify about the agency. It could take weeks, months." The implication hung in the air. They would have to leave. Just when...
"Then I'll go with you,"
Helen said impulsively. Both men looked at her in surprise.
"This land will be here when we return,"
she continued, warming to the idea. "And someone needs to make sure you're treated fairly in Denver. Besides," she smiled slightly, "I've been hiding on this mountain for 7 years. Maybe it's time I saw something of the world." "The city is not kind to Apache," Noel warned, "or to women who stand with them." "Then we'll stand together," Helen said firmly.
"That's what we do now. Isn't it stand together?"
Whitefeather's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "The story continues to change. I like where it's going." That night, as they made plans for the journey to Denver, Helen felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The safe, small life she'd built was ending. But in its place, something larger was emerging, a life with purpose, with connection, with the possibility of love. Outside, Pike brooded in town. His authority diminished, but his hatred intact. The Marshal investigated. The townspeople whispered, and the mountains stood eternal watch. Change was coming to Cedar Ridge, brought by an act of kindness during a storm and the courage to defend what was right. Helen touched Whitefeather's medallion beneath her shirt. The woman who'd worn it had chosen freedom over safety, love over convention. Now, Helen faced the same choice, and like that long-ago woman, she chose the difficult path, the uncertain path, the path that led away from isolation toward connection. The second day was ending. Tomorrow would bring the third day, and with it, new challenges. But tonight, in a cabin that no longer felt like a refuge but a starting point, 3 people planned a future none of them could have imagined a week ago. The mouse had stood up to the eagle, and in doing so, had discovered it could fly. The third day dawned gray and still, with the kind of quiet that presages either peace or storm. Helen woke before the others, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. She stood at the window, watching the lightening sky, when she saw him. Whitefeather sat outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, facing east. His lips moved in what she now recognized as morning prayers, but something was different about his posture, a stillness that went beyond meditation. Helen stepped outside quietly, not wanting to disturb him, but he spoke without turning. "The sun rises on my last morning. Daughter,
Don't say that,
Helen said, though ice formed in her stomach. You're getting stronger. The marshal will take us to Denver, and there are good doctors there. Doctors cannot heal what is finished, Whitefeather said gently. I have lived my seasons, spring of childhood, summer of strength, autumn of wisdom. Now comes winter, and I am content.
No.
Helen knelt beside his chair, taking his weathered hand in hers.
We need you. Noel needs you.
My son needs to let me go, Whitefeather corrected, as I once had to let his mother go. This is the way of things. He turned to look at her, his eyes clear and peaceful. But first, there are words that must be said. Will you gather my son and the coffee an old man should have coffee on his last morning? Helen wanted to argue, to deny what she could see in his face. But there was a dignity in his certainty that demanded respect. She woke Noel gently, whispering only that his father wanted him. The alarm in his eyes told her he, too, sensed what was coming. They sat together on the porch, the three of them. As the sun climbed higher, Whitefeather sipped his coffee with obvious pleasure, savoring each taste. I have been thinking, he said, about stories and their endings. The story of Whitefeather is nearly complete, but the story of my son and the brave woman who opened her door to strangers, that story is just beginning. Father, Noel's voice was rough. You're talking like a man who knows his time, Whitefeather smiled. Yes, my son, because I do. I felt it in the night, the loosening of the threads that hold spirit to flesh. It is not a thing to fear. It is completion. He reached into his pouch and drew out a small leather bundle. This was to be buried with me, but now I think it should live on. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautifully crafted silver ring with a turquoise stone. This was your mother's wedding ring. She gave it to me before her final walk, said to give it to you when you were ready to love again. Noel's hands shook as he took the ring. Father, You are ready, Whitefeather said firmly. I have seen how you look at each other when you think no one watches, how you move together like dancers who hear the same music. Your mother would be glad. He turned to Helen. And you, daughter of my heart, you have given us more than shelter. You have given us home, family, a place to belong in our final days together. He removed a second item from his pouch, a small, intricately beaded medicine bag. This holds the earth of my birthplace, the sacred mountains where Apache boys become men. Keep it, wherever you go. You carry our land with you. You are family now, always. Helen accepted the gift with tears streaming down her face. Whitefeather, please, fight this. We have so much planned. Plans are for the living, he said gently. I have a different journey now. But first, one more story. Will you listen? They nodded, unable to speak. Whitefeather settled back in his chair, his voice taking on the cadence of the traditional storyteller. Long ago, when the world was younger, Eagle asked Creator for the gift of eternal life. Creator smiled and said, You may live forever, but you must never land. You must fly always, never resting, never touching earth again. Eagle, proud and strong, agreed. For many years he flew, watching the world below. He saw Mouse being born, living, dying, being born again in his children. He saw the seasons turn, the mountains grow and shrink, the rivers change their courses. After 1,000 years, Eagle grew tired. His eternal life became a burden. He begged Creator to release him. Creator said, I will give you a choice. You may continue flying forever, or you may land one last time. Rest your wings and join the great circle of life and death. Eagle chose to land, and in that moment of touching earth, feeling the solid ground beneath him, knowing rest was coming, he understood that Mouse had always been wiser. Life's beauty comes from its limits. Love's power comes from knowing it is precious because it does not last forever. Whitefeather's breathing had grown labored during the story, but his voice remained clear. I choose to land. My children. It is time.
Father,
Noel whispered, kneeling beside the chair.
take me inside.
Whitefeather said softly.
I would see one more fire in the hearth.
They helped him to his chair by the fireplace, Helen building the fire up bright and warm. Whitefeather smiled, watching the flames dance. In the old days, he said, when an elder knew his time was near, the people would gather to hear his final words. These words were sacred, never forgotten, passed down through generations. He looked at them both, his love evident. My words are simple. Love fearlessly. Stand for truth. Remember that we are all related, all people, all creatures, all things. The separation is illusion. The connection is real. He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow. Noel held one hand, Helen the other. They sat in sacred silence as the morning aged around them. Sing for me, Whitefeather whispered.
The traveling song, so I know the way.
Noel began to sing in Apache, his voice breaking but continuing. It was a haunting melody, ancient and beautiful. Helen didn't understand the words but felt their power, their purpose, a guide for a spirit preparing to journey. As the song ended, Whitefeather opened his eyes one last time. My wife waits, he said, wonder in his voice. She is young again, laughing. The mountains are green, the water sweet. I go now. And with a gentle exhalation, like wind through pines, Whitefeather's spirit departed. His body remained, but the essential part of him, the part that told stories and made string figures and called Helen daughter, was gone. Noel made a sound of pure grief, burying his face against his father's still hand. Helen wrapped her arms around him, and they mourned together, not as Apache and White, not as man and woman, but as two people who had lost someone precious. Time passed unmarked. The fire burned low. Finally, Noel raised his head, his face wet with tears but composed. He would not want long mourning. He said, in the Apache way, we celebrate the journey forward, not the leaving behind. What should we do? Helen asked softly.
He should lie where he can see the mountains, where the sun will warm him and the stars will watch over him.
Noel wiped his face. Is there such a place on your land?
There's a hill above the cabin,
Helen said.
It faces east, toward the sunrise. In spring, wildflowers cover it. He would have liked it.
They wrapped Whitefeather in the best blanket, the one with the wedding ring pattern Helen's mother had made. It seemed fitting, a joining of traditions, of families. Noel carried his father with a strength that seemed both physical and spiritual, while Helen led the way to the hilltop. The ground was frozen hard, but they worked together, using pickaxe and shovel to create a resting place. As they worked, Noel told stories of his father, the time he faced down a grizzly with nothing but a walking stick, the way he could make children laugh with shadow puppets, his gift for finding water in the desert. When the grave was ready, they lowered Whitefeather gently, facing east as was proper. Noel placed traditional items with him, a piece of turquoise, an eagle feather, a small amount of corn pollen. Helen added her own offering, a sprig of dried wildflowers she'd pressed last summer, a promise of the beauty that would surround him come spring. In the Apache way, Noel said, his voice steady now. We do not speak the names of those who have journeyed on, but we remember their teachings, their love, their stories. These live forever. He picked up a handful of earth. From the earth we come, to the earth we return. The circle is complete. They filled the grave together, then built a cairn of stones to mark the place. When it was finished, they stood in silence, the wind gentle around them, the mountains standing eternal witness. He was right, Helen said finally, about the story changing. A week ago, I was alone, bitter, existing but not living. Then you came, and everything changed. He changed it. You changed it. Noel corrected. By opening the door, by choosing kindness over fear. He saw that immediately. It's why he trusted you, why he called you daughter. They made their way back to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. The place felt different without Whitefeather's presence. Emptier, but also somehow fuller, as if his spirit had expanded to fill every corner with memory. Marshal McBride arrived in the afternoon, immediately sensing the change. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply after they told him. He seemed a man of great dignity. "He was," Noel confirmed. "And he would want us to continue with purpose, not stop for grief." They gave their official statements, signed documents, made plans for the journey to Denver. But underneath the business, grief moved like an underground river, sometimes surfacing in unexpected moments. When Helen automatically set 3 plates for dinner, when Noel reached for the string to show his father a new pattern. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the chairs that would forever hold memory, Noel spoke of the future. "The marshal says the testimony could take weeks. After that, I don't know where I'll go. The reservation holds nothing but bad memories. Mexico is possible, but..." He looked at Helen. "My father saw something I was too afraid to see, or too afraid to hope for." Helen's heart beat faster. "What did he see?" Noel moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands. "He saw that home isn't a place but a person. He saw that you and I..." He stopped, struggling with words. "Helen, I have nothing to offer but myself. No land, no wealth, no certain future. But if you would have me..." "Yes," Helen interrupted, not needing to hear more. "Yes to all of it. To uncertainty and difficulty and whatever comes. Yes to you, to us, to the future your father saw." Noel pulled out his mother's ring, the turquoise catching the firelight. "This ring has seen love that lasted beyond death. Would you wear it? Would you be my wife?" Helen extended her hand, steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. "Your father knew, didn't he, from the beginning?" "He always knew things others missed," Noel agreed, rising to pull her into his arms. "He said the spirits led us to your door. I think he was right." They held each other as the fire burned and night gathered outside. Tomorrow would bring the journey to Denver, the fight for justice, the challenge of building a life together in a world that wouldn't easily accept them. But tonight, in the cabin where strangers had become family, where kindness had defeated hatred, where love had bloomed in winter's heart, they simply existed in the moment. On the hill above, Whitefeather rested beneath stone and earth and sky. But his true monument was below 2 people who had found each other across every divide. Who would carry his stories forward? Who would prove that love could indeed conquer fear? The ring on Helen's finger caught the light as she and Noel sat together, planning a future that would honor the past while embracing tomorrow. Outside, snow began to fall again, but gentle this time, like a blessing on the grave of a man who had changed everything by simply asking for shelter in a storm. In Apache tradition, the dead live on in the memories and actions of those who loved them. By that measure, Whitefeather was more alive than ever, in the courage Helen had found, in the healing of his son's heart, in the love that would carry his grandchildren into a new world. The story he had started was far from over. In truth, it was just beginning. Spring came early to the mountains that year, melting the snow and revealing the wildflowers that kept their promise to bloom around Whitefeather's resting place. Helen stood on the familiar hill, but everything about her had changed. Her hair, once always severely pinned, now hung loose with feathers woven through it, a gift from the Apache women they'd met in Denver. Her dress, while still proper, bore beautiful beadwork on the cuffs and collar, Noel's patient handiwork during long winter evenings. "He would have loved this," she said softly, looking at the carpet of blue columbines and Indian paintbrush surrounding the cairn. "He does love it," Noel corrected gently. placing his arm around her waist. In the Apache way, those who journey on see through our eyes, feel through our hearts. 6 months had passed since they'd buried White Feather. 6 months of testimony in Denver, of newspaper headlines proclaiming corruption at the Fort Apache agency, of small victories and large changes. The agent who had expelled Noel and his father was now in federal prison. Food and supplies flowed properly to the reservation for the first time in years. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. More importantly for Helen and Noel, those 6 months had seen them married in both Apache tradition and American law. The ceremony in Denver had been small. Marshal McBride served as witness. Mrs. Chen traveled from Cedar Ridge to stand with Helen, and, surprisingly, Samuel and Abigail Morrison had come, bringing with them a wedding gift and news from home. Now they were back, ready to face whatever Cedar Ridge had in store for them. "Are you ready?" Noel asked as they made their way down to the cabin. Helen touched the medicine bag at her throat. White Feather's earth, a constant comfort. As ready as anyone can be to face their past. The ride into town felt both familiar and strange. The same mountains watched their passage. The same trees lined the trail. But Helen herself was transformed. She rode beside her husband. How she loved that word, no longer alone, no longer afraid. The first person they encountered was Billy Hartwell, who nearly dropped the supplies he was loading when he saw them. "Miss Dawson, I mean. Mrs." He stopped, clearly unsure how to address her now. "Mrs. Freeman." Helen supplied, using the American name Noel had adopted for legal purposes, though she knew he would always be Noel in his heart. "Hello, Billy. How's the town?" "Different," Billy said, gathering his courage. "Sheriff Pike's gone. The marshal saw to that. We got a new sheriff, man named Cooper from Colorado Springs. He's fair, folks say." He glanced at Noel nervously. "Welcome back, sir." Noel nodded gravely. "Thank you." They continued into town, and Helen could feel the eyes following them. Some hostile, some curious, some surprisingly welcoming. Mrs. Chen appeared from her laundry, face wreathed in smiles. "You came back, I tell everyone. Helen too smart to stay away forever. Come, come. I have tea. You tell me about Denver." But before they could accept, a familiar figure emerged from the general store. Martha Hendricks, looking older and somehow smaller than Helen remembered, stood on the wooden sidewalk, her perpetual scowl deepening. "So it's true," Martha said, her voice carrying down the street. "Helen Dawson married a savage. Your poor parents must be spinning in their graves." Helen felt Noel tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. Dismounting from her horse, she walked directly to Martha, head high. "My parents," Helen said clearly, "taught me to judge people by their actions, not their blood. They taught me that kindness matters more than conformity, that love transcends boundaries. I think they would be proud that I finally learned those lessons." "Proud," Martha's voice rose. "Proud that you've degraded yourself, that you've turned your back on your own kind." "My kind," Helen said softly but firmly, "are those who choose love over hate, courage over cowardice, truth over comfortable lies. If that's not your kind, Mrs. Hendricks, then you're right. I have turned my back on it, and I thank God every day for the storm that brought me the strength to do so." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Helen saw Tom Garrett in the doorway of his store, Pastor Williams near the church, other faces she'd known all her life. This was the moment she dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. "You all know me," she addressed them, her voice carrying, "I've lived among you my whole life, been gossiped about, pitied, scorned for the crime of being different. For 7 years, I accepted that treatment, hid on my mountain, believed I deserved isolation. Then 2 men sought shelter from a storm, and I discovered something." She paused, meeting as many eyes as would hold her gaze. "I discovered that the savage ones were not those who knocked on my door, but those who came in the night with guns and threats. The savage ones were not those who spoke of family and stories and connection, but those who preached division and hatred. I stand before you changed. Yes, but changed for the better. And I stand with my husband, proud of who we are together."
"Pretty speech,"
a harsh voice cut through the murmurs. Jack Curry pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. "But Pike might be gone. Doesn't mean we have to tolerate Indian lovers in our town."
"Actually, you do."
The new voice was calm but carried authority. A tall man with a federal marshal's badge stepped into view. "Cooper's the name, new sheriff. And in my town, every law-abiding citizen is welcome, regardless of who they love or where they come from." Curry's face darkened. "You taking their side?" "I'm taking the law's side," Cooper replied evenly. "And the law says these folks have every right to be here. Anyone who disagrees can discuss it with me. In my jail." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Curry muttered something obscene but backed down, slinking away like the cur he was. "Mrs. Freeman." Sheriff Cooper touched his hat. "Mr. Freeman, welcome home. I've heard about the good work you did in Denver. Takes courage to stand up against corruption." "It takes more courage to stand up against neighbors," Helen replied, glancing at Martha. "But sometimes that's what's needed." Pastor William stepped forward then, his thin face earnest. "Mrs. Freeman is right. I've done a lot of soul-searching these past months. Read my Bible with new eyes. And you know what I found, love? Over and over, the message is love. Love thy neighbor. And it doesn't say, only if they look like you." He extended his hand to Noel. "I owe you an apology. Sir, I let fear override faith. I hope you'll forgive me." Noel studied the pastor for a moment, then shook his hand. "Forgiveness is the beginning of healing. My father taught me that." "Your father was a wise man." Williams said, "I wish I'd had the chance to know him better." One by one, others approached. "Not everyone," Martha huffed away, and several others followed, but Tom Garrett offered them credit at the store. The widow Carson shyly presented Helen with a jar of preserves, welcoming her home. Even some who'd ridden with Pike's posse mumbled apologies or tipped their hats. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Chen insisted they come for tea, in her small kitchen behind the laundry. She peppered them with questions about Denver, the trial, their plans. "We're going to work the land," Helen explained. "Noel has ideas about breeding horses, Apache ponies crossed with American stock, strong and smart and adaptable." "Like your children will be," Mrs. Chen said with a knowing smile. Helen blushed. They hadn't told anyone yet, but the wise woman's eyes missed little. "Children who will grow up free," Noel said quietly. "Not on a reservation, not hidden in shame, free to be both Apache and American, themselves complete." "This is good," Mrs. Chen approved. "Town needs children who see with both eyes, speak with both voices. Change comes slow, but comes sure with each generation." They spent the rest of the day visiting those who welcomed them, avoiding those who didn't. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they finally returned to their cabin, their home. Everything was as they'd left it, but like Helen herself, it felt transformed. The repairs Noel had made gave it new strength, the additions they'd planned in Denver, a larger room for the children to come, a workshop for Noel's leatherwork, would make it truly theirs. "No regrets?" Noel asked as they stood on the porch, looking out at their domain. "None," Helen said firmly. "Oh, I wish your father could have lived to see this. I wish the town could accept us completely. I wish the world was different in so many ways. But regret, no. How can I regret the path that led me to you?" They went inside, lighting the fire in the hearth where Whitefeather had spent his last hours. Helen prepared dinner while Noel worked on a new bridle, the domestic peace settling around them like a comfortable blanket.
I've been thinking, Noel said as they ate, about my father's stories, how they shouldn't be lost.
You want to write them down? I want to teach them. To our children, yes, but also to any who will listen. Apache children who are forgetting their heritage, white children who never knew it. Stories that bridge worlds. Helen reached across the table to take his hand. Your father would love that. Stories living on, changing hearts one telling at a time. That night, as they lay together in the bed they'd shared as husband and wife for 6 months now, Helen marveled at the journey that had brought them here. A week, just 1 week from that first knock on her door to Whitefeather's passing. 1 week that had changed everything. What are you thinking? Noel asked, pulling her closer. About storms and blessings. About how the worst night of that blizzard became the best night of my life. About how saying yes to shelter led to all the other yeses.
Yes to love,
Noel murmured against her hair.
Yes to courage. Yes to us.
Yes to tomorrow, Helen added, placing his hand over the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. And all the tomorrows after. Outside, spring winds sang through the pines, and somewhere an owl called. On the hill above, wildflowers nodded in the starlight over a grave marked with stones and love. And in the cabin where strangers had become family, 2 people who'd been alone found themselves part of something larger, a story that spanned cultures and challenged conventions, a love that bridged worlds. The next morning, they woke to find a gift on their doorstep, a cradle, beautifully carved, with a note, "For the new one coming, from neighbors who are learning to see better, S. and A. Morrison." Helen held the note with trembling hands.
Change really is coming.
My father always said it would. Noel replied. He said hate was loud, but love was patient, that in the end, connection would prove stronger than division. They spent that day working their land, planning for horses and children and a future that would have seemed impossible just months before. As the sun set, they climbed to Whitefeather's grave, bringing fresh flowers and news of all that had transpired. "We're home, Father," Noel said to the stones and sky. "The story you saw is coming true, and we'll make sure your great-grandchildren know who you were, what you taught us, how you changed everything with your faith in human kindness." Helen added her own words, speaking to the man who'd called her daughter. "Thank you for seeing who I could be before I saw it myself, for trusting me with your son, for showing me that family isn't about blood but about choice. We choose each other, every day. We choose love." As they walked back down the hill, hand in hand, the last light painting the mountains gold and rose, Helen thought about the townspeople who'd surprised her with welcome, about those still learning to see past old prejudices, about the children who would grow up in a world slightly wider than the one before. It wasn't a perfect ending. There would still be challenges, still be those like Martha who clung to their bitter beliefs. But it was a true ending, and more importantly, a beginning. The storm that had brought Noel and Whitefeather to her door had passed, but its blessings remained. Love, family, purpose, and the courage to stand for what was right. In the cabin that night, as Noel told one of his father's stories to the child growing within her, Helen touched Whitefeather's medallion and whispered a prayer of gratitude. She'd lived alone for years, until a giant Apache and his old father asked, "Can we stay one night?" One night had become forever, and forever, Helen thought as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, was exactly as long as she wanted it to last. The mountains stood eternal watch. The seasons would turn. Children would be born, and stories would be told. And in a small cabin where love had conquered fear, the future wrote itself in acts of courage, kindness, and the simple human truth that we are all more alike than different, all seeking the same shelter from life's storms. The story that Whitefeather had seen was no longer just possibility. It was reality, lived out daily in the choices of 2 people who'd found each other across every divide and decided that love was worth any price the world might ask. And somewhere, in the place where spirits dwell, An old Apache storyteller smiled, knowing his greatest story, the one he'd helped write with his life and death, would continue long after the last word was spoken.
Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and the power of human kindness in the Wild West. I hope Helen and Noel's journey touched your heart as it did mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this story. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more tales of the American frontier. Hit that like button, and don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover this story. Your support means everything and helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, partners.